The majesty of the Italian landscape contains no shortage of wondrous secrets concerning its structures and its infrastructure. We'll find the common examples of civilizations that are built on top of other civilizations in Italy, and the mainstream has our typical historical account for this. We originally had the Etruscans were followed by the Romans, and there were many other great tribes, the Samnites, and too many to list. And yet in all the beauty of Italy we find examples of previous civilizations, and how many of them are far more contemporaneous than we like to imagine.
I'm no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
Today we look at northern Italy, in our first exploration of a wondrous city that's not Rome or the Vatican. We explore the city of Bologna, a city of wonders, towers, and porticos. What's the mainstream history, though, behind this incredible city? Even the pronunciation of Bologna is something that varies. We refer to the Etruscans, a people whose history we only have examples of through Rome, and then of course the presence of the Roman Catholic Church, producing many great pontiffs and bishops, and even the presence of the Byzantine Empire, supposedly the successor empire of Rome, the very first and continuous university that operates in Bologna to this day. Also a city that was afflicted by the bubonic plague, and many other infrastructure wonders that dot the landscape, to include an incredible opera house. And over time, there was even a library, the State Archives, yet it wasn't established until the 1870s. In 1897, the population was 153,000, up from 71,000 in 1800. Not quite the increase we see in the United States. And then it endured the conflict of World War II, and yet many of its structures survived intact, to include these incredible towers. Towers which are reminiscent of what we think of as skyscrapers today. And indeed, these towers, these skyscrapers, the few that survive in Bologna, remind us of the wonders and the majesty of a city in the distant past that seem to reflect a previous civilization. There's also the many porticos. Everywhere you shop or walk around in Bologna, you'll see no shortage of incredible porticos. And anywhere in Italy, I'm always amazed at the composition of the very streets and the roads, which can still support large buses to this day. And wherever you go in Bologna, you'll see the remaining towers and the structures made of some sort of stone masonry work, whatever the composition is. Let's look at some of the city images from the 18 and 1900s, and this is the most dramatic example of seeing the original towers of Bologna. We'll look at these towers closely at the end of this exploration, and they give the impression of a more modern city. Of course, when we look at such articles on verticality and other modern architectural periodicals, they'll explain this as simply being an anomaly of the time, that there were certain rich families and the culturally elite of Bologna, even before the Renaissance, who decided to build all these wondrous towers. And of course, for those of us with the mindset that we have, we realize that there may be a vastly different explanation and origin behind this incredible city that still endures to this day. We can see the details of architecture that show us that there was a much more advanced civilization at work here. Imagine this city that we're told during the Middle Ages never exceeded a population of 60,000, and then in 1800 their population managed to come up to near 70,000, and then not even 100 years later up over 150,000. And that's explained away by the revolutions of industry and agriculture that we still argue about which one preceded the other. But whatever the mainstream account and the actual history of Bologna is, you will find no shortage of dramatic images that give you the impression of these wondrous structures always being present on the landscape. You'll find no shortage of paintings and pictures that show the infinite porticos that run for miles, leading up to incredible structures, such as this monastery. Yes, yet another isolated monastery. And yet in the streets there are incredible buildings with wondrous detail constructed on them. And many people will accept the mainstream explanation that this was simply the work of people who were more devoted and yet somehow had a tremendous logistical capacity in the 11 and 1200s to build these incredible towers and many of these buildings. When you look into the personal account of many of these buildings or these structures in Bologna, what you'll find is a statement that they've been modified and structures built on top of the other. Indeed, this tends to be the hallmark of any major city in Italy. And we're going to be exploring several, seeking answers for why is it we have these anomalies. The story behind these towers is quite interesting, and to actually give the mainstream some credit, they admit that they don't know the full reason for the towers. There's also the infinite porticos that run through Bologna, where everywhere you see you have arches and covered areas to walk, all made out of solid stone, or concrete, or some mixture. Perhaps it's even some sort of material that we aren't even familiar with. The official explanation will be that Roman concrete was only used during the time of Rome, and yet somehow most of these porticos, we're told, were constructed well after Rome. And you'll find no shortage of public squares or piazzas where the people gather and they have that understanding of what exactly they're doing. Or maybe in some of these pictures they don't seem to know exactly what they're doing and they seem to be just as awed by this architecture as we are. Looking at the interior, you'll also see an interesting combination of stonework and columns that are fully milled and yet other columns that are made of separate blocks and bricks. And was this a monastery or was it some sort of stronghold? And even in this image, we can see just how extensive some of these porticos actually are. This infinite portico that almost feels like it runs the same length of an aqueduct. And it gives the impression of a civilization that had no limits in terms of its logistical capacity or its focus and its capability in order to lay out such an extensive structure that continues on to the very horizon in this image. Imagine the effort that would have been required to construct this. And of course, the mainstream will tell us that there were no shortage of laborers, no shortage of skilled laborers, even in the 11 to the 1500s, and that it all makes perfect sense. Yet you can also see some of the hallmarks of the more advanced architecture looking more closely at the structures. And we've seen all these examples and these patterns before of the layout of the blocks. Indeed, many of the star forts that we've looked at in the United States. And the official explanation is that the very aspect of Rome and the architectural stylings were rediscovered, and then once they were rediscovered, they were shared to other cultures. Yet, looking at many of these images, you can see the examples of much greater advancement just in terms of the detail. Every single adornment above the windows and the doors reflects something that shows a lot more of an attention to detail placed in the artistic expression. If you ask any architect today, they will give you the official explanation of the fact that people valued artistic expression in the past, and there was obviously a lot more money to go around. But even with the money, you still need people who are capable of doing these sorts of things. And the question I'll ask for you to consider today is there any contractor anywhere in the land, whether you're in Europe, Africa, North America, South America, that you could find who could lay out a structure like this? Even a simple structure that's a single-family dwelling that would contain any of these architectural hallmarks. And then could they do it with a genuine material? Would you find any contractor that could actually carry out the task from start to finish and could build with the same quality as this? And once again, the typical explanation you'll get in terms of why it cannot be done is we simply have a shortage of skilled laborers. We don't have the contractors who could do this. And there's other numerous reasons why the quality of construction materials has diminished. It's certainly not because we could not reproduce the quality of these construction materials. Absolutely not. We could. It's just not economically viable. When you actually walk through a city such as Bologna, or really any other city in Italy for that matter, you'll see these examples of these many architectural stylings, and you'll also get the impression of the wondrous logistical capacity that was required to bring all of this building material into a city at that time before the age of motorization and before the time of the train. So how exactly was it done? Simple persistence, is that what we're supposed to believe? Or was there some other capability? Were there other capacities that were present in Italy at a time that we can't even begin to imagine? During a time frame that we're not told to even think on. Remember that Bologna was originally settled by Etruscans. Of course, we don't really have any history of Etruscans except for the history that was recorded by Rome, the city-state that defeated the Etruscans and then either amalgamated or destroyed their civilization. And there's even conflicting accounts on that. There's even the conflicting accounts of the fact that we always talk about in history how we oftentimes rediscover the great advancements and achievements of both Rome and Greece. And indeed, when we look at Bologna University, we'll find one of the individuals who was allegedly responsible for that. Looking at the towers, though, you get the impression that there were greater intentions behind them, that perhaps these are just the smaller towers that remain, that there may well have been more dramatic and studious examples of the architectural achievements of the past that we cannot simply explain. What remains today, though, is still impressive, and you don't see anyone building like this anywhere in the land, for the aforementioned reasons that we have. And when you go to Bologna, or if you go to any of the other cities across the Italian peninsula, you'll see these examples. You also should pay attention to the composition of the very roads and the streets that all these structures are built upon. And remember when we explored the Vatican, the labyrinth and almost maze-like precision that they had in the construction of the foundations. Consider that with all these buildings and all of this overlapping infrastructure that's built on top of each other. Does it really give the impression of a singular city that was laid out over time and somehow everything just seemed to fit together because of circumstance? Or was it an original plan? Original plan that was carried out by a civilization that had a greater capacity for both logistics and the ability to plan. Or we just simply believe the mainstream account, that there were all of these polymaths who were experts in everything, who just seemed to multiply at a particular time, and they were responsible for the sudden revolution in architectural stylings that came across Italy all at the same time during the so-called Renaissance period. What's interesting to me, though, about Bologna is that the very towers themselves, and indeed many of the structures we're told, were actually planned and then constructed before the Renaissance period, or that they were responsible for motivating and inciting the Renaissance period. How convenient. Is that exactly how it worked, or is there a much different explanation? Is it simply because there were people who had wealth and resources that decided they were going to devote those wealth and resources towards architectural constructions and artistic expression, and that was going to be their way of leaving their mark? Or were there other explanations? Because as we always talk about when we look at these great cities and these wondrous structures, their very presence seems to defy the explanation of these being simple vanity projects, as indeed many of these structures reflect a community project. And of course we have our early presence of trolleys within Bologna, Italy, in many of these images that we see in the 1800s. Of course, we have an image of a horse-pulled trolley, which is quite intriguing, as it's not just simply a horse-pulled cart, and we have our usual explanations for that. So once again, it's the same pattern that we have in the images that we've seen in many of the explorations that we've done in the United States, which show us that this almost seems to be an area that was rediscovered and repopulated in a very short amount of time. Bologna contains the oldest continuous university in the land, the University of Bologna. And since being in operation in 1088, it contains many wondrous alumni who have made quite a difference across the land. And what a very impressive university. Imagine looking at such architecture every day when you go to classes. And I have no doubt that the individuals that we're told about in history, look at that. Let's not forget that in Italy we had the Ator, the Fighting Eagle series, which included the hubcap from Napa and, oddly enough, a cameo from Paul Wellstone, Senator of Minnesota. Noted alumni include Batizia Gozzadina, who was a jurist or a lawyer. Yes, one of the very first prominent female students who was a lawyer even before the Renaissance. Quite a fascinating account when we're constantly told about how women had no rights or no place in society, and yet we have conflicting historical accounts that show that they were quite essential in history. And indeed, Batizia here was quite an effective lawyer, apparently, as she's remembered in history. And of course, we think about the aspects of legal work and jurists in pre-Renaissance Italy. Then we have Petrarch, who was a poet and apparently one of the individuals who rediscovered Rome, one of many, and you can see that the thrilling headgear styles at the time was not confined to the ladies. Imagine wearing an outfit like that, much like we were told to wear facial adornments 4 years ago. And then we have Pope Alexander VI, another alumni of Bologna University, who is known for very controversial, how shall we say, personal tastes He was the Pope who actually had children, so you can see that no children with the clergy was around back then. And Umberto Eco, the author of the book The Name of the Rose, which is featured many times in this particular channel. Umberto Eco had quite the history himself. Indeed, the very libraries that dot the landscape across Italy are always compelling, and you'll find no shortage of them in these wondrous buildings and structures that are all across the landscape of Bologna, the University of Bologna containing many of them. And whether you're going there for economics or genetics or literature or whatever your particular major will be, you'll find yourself completely overtaken by the wondrous beauty in the architecture. I believe this particular tower is supposedly part of the College of Economics. Imagine seeing a structure like that when you're studying economics. But don't worry, the University of Bologna has some more modern buildings, and oddly enough, the astronomy department is supposedly located in that one. But looking at these immense public squares and seeing how the university itself is integrated within Bologna, and for the surrounding image on this particular portion of the exploration, I am showing a university from Ukraine because Bologna was supposedly the inspiration in 1088 for all the universities that followed. So wherever you are in the land, whenever you look at the beauty of any university, we're officially told it was inspired by the continuous operating university in Bologna from 1088, and that's why you have all these wonderful and gorgeous buildings that seem to accompany every university, at least according to the mainstream account. Well, let's go from the university to the Bologna Cathedral, built 910 to the 1700s, and it's still incomplete to this day. And we've looked at many cathedrals on this channel, and this one has a little bit more of an interesting account to it. Not to say that they all aren't interesting, but that's because we're told officially that this one is not complete. And indeed, when you look at the front facade, you can see that it's clearly not complete. Or is that actually what happened, or is there some other account behind it? Perhaps they took portions of the exterior to aid in construction of other buildings, such as they did with the cover stones of the pyramid. Or maybe there's some other account behind it. Officially, we're told that there was originally a cathedral here, there's the usual story of fire and damage, and then they had to build a new cathedral. And then they spent a good 800-900 years building that cathedral. Additions, subtractions. There's even diagrams that show what different designs of the completed facade would look like. Very strange that we have so many of these designs that are readily available in the records, even though we're told that the state archive didn't even start until the late 1800s. But perhaps there were previous archives that were available that did a good job of preserving the records, and we're not simply looking at recordings that were done later, or sketches that give other indications for what the Bologna Cathedral were actually supposed to look like. Or another possibility, that these are actually drawings of other structures that were present across the landscape in Bologna, that are no longer present to this day. Not that I'm suggesting that anyone would do such a thing, I'm just posing other explanations for why we have so many drawings. And once again, you can see that there is an incredible and almost spiritual beauty that we have with all these cathedrals and their interiors. And yet we have to remember that the ability to produce and reproduce this beauty is not confined to Italy. It can be done anywhere across the land. But yet you can see the same kind of geometric precision that we see across these structures, almost indicating that they may have had a different function at one point in time. And again, were the pews part of the construction? Were they added later? And of course, it wouldn't be a cathedral without the wondrous and almost futuristic appearing organs that we always come across. And there's a couple different examples of wondrous organs that we have in this Bologna Cathedral. Look at the ceiling and the way that the columns reach up to it with all the detailing on it. And even though the exterior is incomplete, it did not detract them from finishing the interior. Now, recall that it's much more difficult to construct such an elaborate interior of a building than it is the exterior, and here's why they didn't spare the detail. And interestingly enough, it's hard to pinpoint exactly when each portion of the cathedral in Bologna was officially constructed according to the mainstream history because of the fact that it's been added to so many times. Perhaps it seems a little modest on the outside, but the aspect we have to remember is just how intricately all this is fit together, as it is in the other cities of Italy, and recall our exploration of the Vatican. But then once you get in the inside and you see the wonders of the architectural detailing and the beauty of even the organs and every single decoration that's across these wondrous cathedrals, and suddenly it reflects not only a spiritual strength, but perhaps a strength of a humanity or something. that is motivated beyond our true ability to understand? What does it actually reflect? Is there a real religious element to it? There may well be. Or there could be something even beyond our ability to fully understand. Every time I look at one of these organs, I'm reminded of how it seemed we had the capacity to construct wonders in the past that we don't seem to be able to reproduce today. And yet the same people who will denigrate you for thinking such a thing will tell you that, of course, people in the past had more capability. Yes, it's a contradiction. It's an intentional contradiction because you're just supposed to believe exactly as you're told to believe. Questioning things is not something that you're encouraged to ever do, which is interesting to me as it seems to fly in the very face of what was the original scientific method. But we have to recall that there's a difference between methods and dogmatic beliefs. I could understand, though, why someone would want to embrace a dogmatic belief looking at such a structure like this that seems to have been divinely inspired. And even on the more modest exterior, you can see that we still have the same architectural stylings that were told motivated and inspired the buildings across the land, with the columns and the pillars that are integrated in the very walls, and intricate detailing. Still, the front facade of this Cathedral of Bologna is quite intriguing, and it does point to a very different account than what we're told. Are we really to believe that there's all these examples of all these structures that they spent hundreds of years building and rebuilding and modifying? Or is there another account behind these structures? Were these structures once part of an even grander overall design? And indeed, that's often the impression that you get when you explore the beautiful and yet mysterious cities across Italy, Bologna notwithstanding. And the aspect that always intrigued me, and if you ever walk around a city in Italy, is just how they managed to make such efficient use of all the space, as though it were planned out in ways that we can't quite imagine. And no shortage of incredible cathedrals across the land, and now we go to the Bologna Municipal Theatre, supposedly built 1763, although hard to ascertain exactly when it was constructed. And once again, this is another example of these incredible theaters or opera houses that we have across the land, whether it's supposedly for opera or even in the smallest towns in the United States, we always seem to have a wondrous opera house. We have the same portico present because the portico seems to be a style that's pertinent to Bologna, which is interesting as it shows there may be architectural variances. Of course, the arches themselves are to be seen everywhere. And the interior of this theater is lavish and large and beautiful and spacious beyond the ability to imagine. The 1760s. Actually, there's accounts that say it was constructed through the 1750s, but who's to know for sure? And you have the usual adornments of the chandeliers and the vast, tall windows, which we're told was to allow the lighting in. Although how exactly they allowed the lighting into the theater, those are questions you're not supposed to ask, because remember, electricity was not invented until the later 1800s. And who needed that, though, to light a theater like this? They just had candles, and people were very persistent. Or maybe they just didn't do shows at night. Again, those are questions you're not supposed to ask. It's not just the main theater, though. When you look at many of the entryways and the lobbies and the gathering rooms, or whatever you want to call them, the assembly rooms, you'll see the same detailing that you see in the main theater. The wonderful overlap and intersecting of many architectural styles. And I have to ask, how exactly was this achieved in the 1700s as we're told? Well, simple, persistence, and they had money. I don't know what it is, though, but every time I look at one of these beautiful theaters and all the elaborate adornments that they have on the inside, I'm always reminded of something. I'm reminded of how they reflect and echo sound and how they're designed for that. But what was their original purpose? Of course, in an opera house, I have flashbacks of something like this coming to my mind. I think I see my friend Ramirez down there. He's performing in the audience. I can't believe it. I remember when we were from Zeist. Yes, Zeist. Okay, that's really, really hard on the throat. Might need to get a brush down there for that. But opera houses have always been a part of our society and our culture, and every time we look at these amazing theaters, they never cease to inspire me. And we're supposed to believe that these were all done simply for entertainment purposes, because we appreciated opera, and now we appreciate good movies. And finally, we go to the mystery of the towers. Built 1100 to 1200 or so, we're told, and we're told that these towers were supposedly built by the wealthy families of Bologna. Now keep in mind, this was well before the Renaissance, and this was well before the Industrial Revolution, which is sort of our cheat code, if you will, to explain things. Of course, we could use the other cheat code and say that it was forced labor that did this. Now, the Romans had slavery, and during the medieval time frame, we're told that they had serfs. But how exactly did they achieve this in Bologna in 1100 to 1200? To be fair to the mainstream, they don't know the exact purpose behind these wondrous towers, and yet when you look at some of the old images or renderings of Bologna, you can get an idea of its glory. To this day, they're called the lost skyscrapers of Italy, and you can see why that is so. We'll completely ignore the fact that there is a very unique commonality with the appearance of a modern city. And consider the fact that we're told that many of these towers, or skyscrapers, or whatever you want to call them, have been lost over the years. Now, there's a leaning one, and much like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, it seems to be an example of how old world architecture was just not that safe and not that stable. We'll just completely ignore the fact that those towers are still standing to this day, and that they're closing on 1,000 years old in some cases. Can you imagine building a structure today that'll last for 1,000 years? I mean, I'm sure we can go ahead and believe that our modern skyscrapers will, and if you want to believe that, you're welcome to. And I guess as it all comes down, we'll see. But with the older structures in these towers in Bologna, you can see that they're not just towers, they have the same kind of base stones. And for some reason, I'm reminded of the standpipe water towers that we explored in St. Louis and in other cities across the United States. So again, we're seeing these common architectural touches and these common touches in engineering. Although this is from 11 to 1200, and then we're told that those standpipe water towers in the United States were constructed predominantly from 1870 onward. So what's the actual explanation? Are we to really believe the mainstream historical account that we just have these overlaps in architectural stylings because they were rediscovered, and when they were rediscovered, people managed to be experts in them, and therefore they built exact replicas of what came before with the exact same type of material? And if we actually go and visit these structures in person and you assess the material yourself, you'll notice they're the exact same thing. It's certainly not a lot of the facading or the, how shall we say, lesser quality construction material that's available in abundance to us to this day. I'm sure there is a logical explanation, and of course it's because of economic reasons. Indeed, when you look at the top of these towers, though, you get the impression that they seem to be more for offensive and defensive purposes. And again, I'll give credit to the mainstream in this aspect because they do admit they don't fully know what the purpose of these towers were. And I'll be honest, I don't know what the purpose of these towers were. Were they for residence? Did they have some other function? Perhaps there's a clue in the offensive and defensive aspects behind them. How exactly does one use a tower, which is supposed to be supposedly a defensive fortification, for offensive purposes? Unless these towers had some other capability behind them that we're not aware of, and it's only alluded to in what we still have in the recorded history, at least what of the recorded history that may be factual, and the myths and the legends. And indeed, we can also attempt to extrapolate or speculate in terms of their actual function. Now, I ask you, what are you supposed to do? If the mainstream does not have an explanation for what these towers were built for, are you just supposed to accept the fact that they were there? Well, they were there. We don't know their purpose, and we shouldn't try to guess, because that's just wrong to do, until someone comes along and tells us what we should think about something. Or perhaps you can exercise your minds and use the creativity and imagination that you're endowed with to try to find the actual explanation for what these towers may have been constructed for. And with that, I leave it to you to let me know in the comments. What do you believe is the real purpose behind these towers? Are these merely the vanity project of the wealthy and elite of Bologna from 11 to 1200, or do they reflect a previous civilization, the bare bones remnants of it? Bologna is a fascinating city. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
I'd love to stay, but
laughing a lot on this set about where are you from Zeist, and
Tombs, temples, and palaces. Everywhere we go across the land, we'll find a plethora of buildings that seem to fall under these broad categories. Why do we have so many tombs and temples, and what do we consider palaces? Today we're going to take our first look at the wondrous Taj Mahal, an architectural achievement from hundreds of years in the past. We're also going to look at some other examples of the structures that fall in the broad categories of tombs, temples, and palaces.
this isn't an ordinary fight.
This is a fight between the powers of light and darkness.
It would appear with the remnants of structures from previous civilizations that we would have to redesignate them in our current civilization, and today we're going to explore some of the most obvious examples. We begin with the U.S. President tombs, and we've looked at these before, starting with Grant's tomb in New York City. President Ulysses S. Grant, an individual who's credited with winning the United States Civil War by using relentless frontal attacks and showing some operational aptitude in some of the battles he won, such as Vicksburg. But his presidency was rife with controversy and corruption, at least that's what the official history tells us. But in more recent years, as with other presidents, they've reevaluated his reputation, and therefore it makes it an understanding as to why he would deserve such a fabulous tomb. And indeed, this is a very wondrous tomb that shows the architectural stylings of what we might think of as Roman Greco, or perhaps it even integrates other architectural stylings such as Second Renaissance or Second Empire or Roman Greco-Renaissance, or even my favorite Gargamel revival style. In any event, these U.S. presidential tombs are very impressive structures, and Ulysses S. Grant's tomb is the most well-known. And you can see that it has the same architectural stylings that we've come to expect in our great Capitol buildings that we've seen in many other explorations. It has the pointed top and the many columns that surround the cupola. Why exactly, though, do we have some U.S. presidents that warrant such wondrous tombs? And there's a slew of explanations that attempt to address these questions. Well, some presidents had more personal finances. Of course, again, according to the official history, Ulysses S. Grant was in financial doldrums after he was swindled. Yes, isn't that ironic? A presidency that was rife with corruption. The president himself was subsequently the victim of corruption and being swindled. And he had to write his book on his Civil War memoirs that restored his family fortune. But are we to believe that it restored the family fortune to an extent that such a stellar and incredible tomb, which we know that at best we would be challenged to reproduce today, if we could at all, depending on what your assessment of the capabilities of modern contractors may be, yet somehow in the 1800s they managed to erect this wondrous tomb for President Ulysses S. Grant. Now, it's not just looking at the history and comparing and contrasting it with the intricate architecture that makes these explorations intriguing. It's also the fact that we see the many different layers, if you will, of the history, or the official account that's allegedly depicted in these buildings. For example, you can see these wondrous arches and indentations that make up the baseline structure of Grant's tomb. And much like many other structures, we are constantly renovating it, whether it's Grant's tomb, Garfield's tomb, or McKinley's tomb. Indeed, they have the most impressive tombs. Nope, we did not build a very magnificent tomb for the greatest U.S. president of all time, or at least the second greatest, depending on whether you count Washington as being first, which we're supposed to. We also have a temporary vault that was used to store Ulysses S. Grant's remains after he passed away. So that book must have been very successful to restore his family fortune, although the mainstream tries to address this concern with presidents retiring and then being in a very poor state of economic affairs by providing them a pension, because what happened to Ulysses S. Grant was considered, quite frankly, terrible at the time. And there was never a U.S. president who could retire and live in the unfortunate reality of poverty. No, that's only for the people in the workhouses. When you look at Grant's tomb, and if you visit it in person, though, you'll be amazed at how impressive the materials are. And indeed, it's the same thing for William McKinley's tomb. And you might recall President McKinley was the president who was unfortunately assassinated during the World's Fair in Buffalo under very mysterious circumstances. And indeed, the trial and sentencing of the assassin was, well, for the American justice system, a matter of tremendous rapidity, and certainly not something that we tend to see in alacrity with our judicial affairs in the 2000s. But whether you're looking at McKinley's tomb or Garfield's tomb or Grant's tomb, you'll see the intricate architecture, the reliefs, and the many different elements of architectural styling that we tend to see that seem to reflect buildings of the past. Indeed, when we explored Garfield's tomb, and thanks to the good people of Cleveland who apparently donated the funds for it, that's the story behind it, you'll notice that it looks rather aged even in its initial appearances. And this is no doubt something that we have reflected in different images. Now, you could explain this by saying, well, the images were in black and white. Sometimes things just look older because they're in black and white. But when you study the details very carefully, there's no doubt that this original ornamentation and this color palette no doubt existed in the 1800s. Or maybe you just go with what Calvin's dad said in Calvin and Hobbes and just go with the recommendation that perhaps the entire world was in black and white until the 1930s, and then it turned to a color that was a little grainy. Let's go to France to look at Les Invalides, built 1671 to 1706. And French speakers, please correct my pronunciation on that. Sometimes I'm okay with French, sometimes I struggle. Christopher Lambert always shows up to laugh at me. But this is another one of these impressive complexes that we're informed was built to be what we would call a soldier's home that we explored extensively in the United States. Yes, during this time frame, 1671 to 1706, the French monarchy was concerned with the care of French soldiers. And you'll even find paintings of Napoleon visiting his injured soldiers in this very immense and amazing complex. Now, there is a variety of explanations for why they built such an ornate and elaborate complex or series of structures to care for their soldiers. And of course, you can compare and contrast this with the accounts that we have of the soldiers' homes that were built in the United States, both for the Union and Confederate veterans of the Civil War. And of course, compare that with the modern veterans' homes that we have. It's a little sad in some ways. But on the other hand, I'm thinking about this very complex structure, and looking at it in the overhead aerial, you can see the fine geometric precision with the layout of the complex and the central dome, and even the way that all the roads and the walkways seem to integrate and have a fine nexus point to them, or perhaps even a series of nexus points, depending on how you want to define it. This is where the remains of Napoleon Bonaparte, and indeed several members of his family and descendants, are buried. So it went from being a soldier's home, or the French version of a soldier's home, to an elaborate tomb. And of course, this goes back to the account that we looked at last week, where we considered Napoleon's very wonderful retirement. Well, there is a very interesting historical account about how France, after the rule of Napoleon, had to play a very complex diplomatic game in order to have Napoleon's ashes returned to the wonders of France. Napoleon said that he loved the French people. And indeed, they loved him too, and didn't concern themselves with the fact that nearly 1 million of them were killed during the Napoleonic Wars. He was just trying to do what was best for France, and he did his best. He was respected, he was given a good retirement, even by his adversaries, and naturally he had to be returned to France so his ashes, or actually his remains, could be interred. The account of how they actually exhumed him in St. Helena is quite intriguing in and of itself, and the way they looked at the remnants of Napoleon and what a wonderful preserved condition he was in. Well, this is his tomb today in Les Invalides, or the Old Soldier's Home, and it's a very impressive structure. Indeed, you can see that this is quite frankly a tomb that matches, or dare I say exceeds, the tombs that we just saw of the US presidents. All for Napoleon. Napoleon, the individual who started terrifying wars in the 1800s and was directly responsible for the death of over 6 million individuals. The number seems to come up a lot, I'm not sure why, but maybe it's just another coincidence. In the older images, you can see that this has always been a very impressive structure, and of course, because of its early construction date, we naturally do not have construction photos. And I really couldn't find any construction paintings or sketches, although there's, as usual, no shortage of sketches with the plans. You can see that it's an elaborate complex, and that, indeed, even the very ground and the roads and the walkways seem to have an elaborate set of stones behind them. And I'm always questioning what materials these are made out of, especially since we have questionable elements to what materials actually go into the construction of these wonderful structures. Just trying to put myself in what we're told of 1706 with individuals wearing leggings, and then you look at the works of Victor Hugo where people were in a dire state of poverty, yet somehow they managed to pull off these stunning architectural achievements. But, as always, we always say the history of Europe is much deeper and has many more years behind it than the history of the United States, so such wonderful structures with their intricacies and wondrous detail is simply explained through the passage of time. Well, officially, the structure took 35 years to build, and you can see the usual array of arches, pediments, windows, decorations, and a very complex and elaborate dome. And granted, this is somewhat after the construction of St. Paul's in London, of course to replace the earlier St. Paul's Cathedral, and we could compare and contrast the domes. We also look at some of the elaborate structures and statues on the inside with Napoleon's tomb. And just by looking, you get the impression that this is all genuine material, the finest decorations that go up in the cupola. But this is not a state capitol officially. We're told that this was originally a soldier's home, the French version of it, and that it was converted into a tomb. Although you could say this is one of these structures that definitely falls under all three of the designations that we have in this exploration. You could say it's a palace, it's a temple, and it's a tomb. And traditionally we associate government buildings with palaces, we associate religious buildings with temples, and tombs are where we put the remains of individuals that are very important, or at least that we are informed by history, in terms of the historical evaluation, were very important. Again, imagine if this sort of a treatment was allocated to the individual with the mustache from the 1930s and the 1940s in Germany. I wonder what the response would be. And here, as you can see in some of the sketches, we have interiors of this very complicated and elaborate dome. And once again, we can question the orientation of the plans and the lack of all perspectives, but that doesn't necessarily prove or disprove anything. It's just interesting, like many other things are. Again, with the impressive statues always keeping watch over Napoleon's tomb. And you have to ask yourself that question. If you're going to get a good retirement, and if you're going to have an elaborate tomb, what exactly do you have to achieve? Do you really have to rule a nation as an emperor or a dictator, or however you want to designate Napoleon? It depends on what historical accounts you consult. And you'll find yourself placed in this very elaborate tomb, this entire palace complex, which is really what this soldier's home actually is. And indeed, we think of the elaborate construction that we have for many of the so-called soldiers' homes that still exist to this day in the United States. And you may recall we did an exploration of the very impressive one in Milwaukee. I'm sure that to this day, Napoleon can rest easy, knowing that he had a comfortable retirement. Looks like that statue has the hand a little lower, but it's a hidden hand. I don't know where he's actually sticking it, do you? And now let's look at the Taj Mahal, constructed 1631 to 1653 in India. Officially, this is a fine example of Islamic and Hindu architecture, or depending on how you actually want to designate it. But we're not going to concern ourselves with the historical account. We're simply going to appreciate the wonders of this structure. This is a very well-known and appreciated structure across the land. Indeed, anywhere you go, people will talk about visiting the Taj Mahal. We're informed that its construction material is fine marble, and that it has many wondrous intricacies to it. Indeed, a uniquely shaped dome, minarets and towers, and of course the fine stone patterns that lay out the walkways, or the promenade, or whatever you want to call it. And you can see that there is wondrous and beautiful detail behind this particular structure. It's easy to understand why people would come across the lands to visit this in vast droves. And indeed, this structure is just as intricate on the inside, where we can see the fine detailing of interior architectural stylings. Now, we're informed that the historical account indicates that an individual who was a ruler decided to construct this for their significant other, although many people aren't even aware that the Taj Mahal is actually part of a complex in and of itself. That tends to be the case with a lot of tombs, is that they're actually part of a complex. Although one could understand why people wouldn't be aware of that, because typically the main structure of the Taj Mahal is what's featured, not the other structures that are on the same grounds. And so it leads to other questions about what was really happening. It could be that the main elements of this historical account are true, but when you look at the fine artistry and inscriptions that go across the walls and the exterior walls of the Taj Mahal, you cannot help but be awed and in wonderment in terms of everything that's displayed within the structure. And indeed, you can understand why it is a very profound and, dare I say, spiritual experience to visit a structure like this in person, regardless of what your personal beliefs may be. And even if you totally accept the historical account of its origin, which is completely fine, or you believe there may be an alternative account in terms of the construction of this very impressive structure, I think we can all agree that this is something that we definitely would not be able to replicate today. Well, let's take a look at some palaces, and as we stated earlier, the palaces reflect the government buildings, as we call them, the many wondrous state capitals of the United States, such as Austin, Texas. We're going to be doing an on-site exploration in Austin, Texas coming up soon. And no, the capital of Texas is not Houston, contrary to what Powers Booth said in the film Red Dawn. Looking on the inside of the dome, you can see a very impressive palette of colors, and yet it gives the impression of gold. There is also the Rhode Island Capitol, such a very impressive capital for a geographically small state, although we don't want to diminish the importance of Rhode Island. We also want to remember the fact that Rhode Island is not actually an island, but it's a pretty interesting name, and it's got a very beautiful Capitol building. Definitely a state to explore. And if you go to the state capitol in Pennsylvania, you'll see the same architectural stylings. And most of these wondrous U.S. state capitals were constructed in the 1800s. We do have some accounts of impressive ones that were constructed in the early 1900s. And then we even have the old state capital of Louisiana, which looks exactly like a castle. And don't worry, for those of you who are fans of the current state capital of Louisiana, we will be exploring that soon as well. That's quite an interesting story in and of itself. But whether you're looking at the federal capital, or you're looking at the state capital in Texas, or you're looking at St. Paul's Cathedral, which in London, oddly enough, bears a resemblance to a U.S. state capital, or the U.S. state capitals bear a resemblance to the cathedral in St. Paul in London that we're seeing right now. Nice little eagle. Or is it a phoenix? Or is it some other kind of bird? Well, it's not a double-headed bird, so. I've always been fascinated, though, by the account of the Iowa State Capitol, and indeed you know it is building number one for all explorations on this channel. I know that you're all well aware of how much I appreciate the Iowa State Capitol, and imagine my surprise when I went inside and they told us that scagliola is this imitation marble or granite that's in all the columns. And of course they give us these examples that we can't handle. These two examples that have the exact same name despite being imitation marble and granite. Maybe there's some other names we could come up with. Perhaps fakeola? It's fakeola material, or maybe we could call the marble fakeola, and the granite dufaciola. Dufaciola is your imitation granite, or call both of them obeiola. See, some alternate names that seem a little more catchy. I don't know, I'm getting the impression that someone's trying to sell us wooden nickels yet again. And you think about that whole concept, people from the rural areas going into the cities and then told to beware of imitations, and then being told that all their structures are imitations, such as the structures at the World's Fair. And now the columns in the Iowa State Capitol are imitations. Now, do you really believe that? Well, look at the actual columns and examine the strength, and you can still touch the columns in the Iowa State Capitol. At least there's no sign that says that you can't. And you can actually compare and contrast it visually with what you have with what's displayed on one of these fine radiators. And of course these don't seem to be actual material, and of course they do admit that they're handmade. So I wonder, compare and contrast what they're displaying here to the column in the background. And do you really think that this column is actually some sort of fake material? Are all these columns that hold up the elaborate dome of the Iowa State Capitol from the official historical account since 1886 or earlier, or whenever the columns were put in there, were actually made of some sort of fake imitation material? Find it a little hard to believe. But of course the other material, the Iowa State Capitol, they're not going to say is some sort of fake or imitation material. And if you go and you assess these columns, you'll find that they tend to be real. Looking at the account of the Great Fire at the Iowa State Capitol, which it managed to survive, we can see the original news clipping from the Register. And this picture, which oddly enough still has the same issues that we have with all the pictures of the Iowa State Capitol fire in the early 1900s. And of course conflicting accounts of damages, and that's the original paper, but that's the best picture that you tend to get. And of course we have the candles, and these displays really communicate to us that this is exactly what happened. There was this terrible fire, and the heroic efforts of one individual prevented this fire from destroying the Iowa State Capitol. And then of course the individual who saved the state capitol then fell to their death later. I also saw this interesting picture I hadn't seen in the Iowa State Capitol. It shows the 168th Infantry Regiment posing for a picture, a painting, a combined picture or painting that shows the Capitol grounds in 1919. And we can see the Soldiers and Sailors column, or the Soldiers and Sailors monument. And oddly enough, when you look at this image, it's hard to tell or determine the difference between real and fake. And there we have that smoke column that appears in the picture, and oddly enough, some sort of triumphal arch. Now, neither the triumphal arch or the smoke column exist on the Capitol grounds to this day. So what is this really telling us? Well, you can also look in the interior of the dome of the Iowa State Capitol and compare and contrast it with the interior of the dome in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and you'll find many similarities. in terms of layout and how they look and all the renovations that they're constantly doing on both structures. It's as though someone really is trying to give us a different impression. And of course, looking at the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, the one that they built in the 1890s but didn't bother to dedicate to the Iowa Civil War veterans until 1945, when there were only 6 of them left. There's other structures in Des Moines I haven't looked at, such as this Scottish Rite Temple. Ah, yes, a Scottish Rite Temple. Very impressive structure, and it looks like we have continuous columns. And, well, isn't that an interesting little eagle there with the number 32? And it looks like the symbol of the Triforce there in the middle of it. I don't know why, I just have Legend of Zelda vibes. That's just me. There's also this little minor basilica that's not too far from Drake University, which we explored before. And this is yet another structure that falls in that 1890 to 1920 wondrous construction period. Of course, the accounts of its construction tend to vary, and we see that they decided to cut all the stones in a unique shape and fit them together as though they were playing a very intricate game of Tetris, because, well, why not make things more difficult when you're constructing it? Now, I don't know what actually happened, I wasn't there to witness it, but I can certainly look and appreciate the structure for all that it is. Indeed, this very tall and impressive tower that has other elements to it that for some reason reminds me of the towers that we saw in Bologna, albeit a much shorter one. And much as is the case with other structures, they're constantly renovating this minor basilica, or whatever we want to call this particular structure. It's just interesting to me looking at some of the symbolism behind it, if this was actually a Catholic structure. And let's not forget that it has an obelisk on the grounds too, and then it's connected in yet another complex. So what are your thoughts on these temples, tombs, and palaces? What do you think's the real story behind them? I think every time we do these explorations we uncover a little more, but please share your thoughts with me. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. The impressive fortifications that you'll see across Europe and the entire land of wondrous castles that have polygon construction were informed by the mainstream that the explanation for these elaborate, geometrically precise constructions came from the advent of gunpowder, or at least the adoption of gunpowder for use in medieval battles. As a result, Europe needed to prepare their castles and fortifications to resist these wondrous weapons, these immense cannons. And that's how the mainstream explains these elaborate structures, these fortifications that they call bastion forts, and that we also call star forts.
Guards! Knights! Squires! Prepare for battle!
Today we explore star forts, cities, and more, and as we look at one of the many maps that we have that plot the various locations of all the star fort fortifications, or bastion forts, or geometrically precise foundation structures, we have many different names, we notice that they're across all the major continents, North, South America, especially in Europe, Africa, Asia, and yet we notice that there are virtually none in Australia. We do have a few in New Zealand, although these are listed as redoubts and tend to appear more as some sort of dug-up earthenworks, or at least that's what they would have called them back in the time. What's the explanation for having all these star forts in Europe? Well, the explanation is this is where people had to defend from the medieval use of cannons, because apparently gunpowder was not invented in China. And you'll see every variety of star fort when you look at the map. Some are very small fortifications that don't appear to take up much space, and yet you have others that are almost half a mile in diameter, some even larger, some even smaller. What's the real story behind these star forts? Are we to accept that this is simply a period of Renaissance engineering to respond to the use of cannons? We see so many different details when we examine star forts, in addition to their geometrically precise foundations. We can also note many examples where we actually have cities and towns that were built on top of the foundation of a star fort, such as the famous example in Italy, where you'll find the remnants of many star forts, and here you might see an eroded bastion fort, as they would call it. And yet in other places that you look, you'll see the very dramatic example, such as with Palma Nova in Italy, of an incredible star fort that is an entire town or city. We'll be informed by the mainstream that this was the final development of the fortified Renaissance town. Let's look at some aerial imagery of star forts and see what we can really ascertain by doing a proper analysis. And what will be informed is that the entire reason for this construction is to provide what is called enfilading fire with cannons. In other words, the reason that you have these very geometrically precise foundation structures that tend to integrate well with water is the water provides a natural obstacle, and you can employ your cannons on either side of these protrusions out of the star fort, and therefore you can achieve enfilading fire. Apparently in this particular case, as the enemy is trying to assault your city in canoes. That's what the mainstream will tell us. And yet, when you examine enough of these star forts and you see the vast disparity between the smaller star forts and the larger ones, you can get an idea that this explanation of fortifications seems, well, not exactly something that we can just easily accept at first value. Perhaps the main reason being is that there always seems to be effort in which the way that these star forts are constructed, that they integrate wonderfully with the natural environment. Well, they were masters of camouflage at that time. And yet, even to this day, despite the fact that many of these star forts we're told were constructed hundreds of years ago, the basic structure and the geometric precision holds up wonderfully to this day. And you can see many from the aerial images. You can see the complexity in what we're told is polygon construction. But there's so much more to it than just simple geometrically precise construction. There are many different dimensions behind these elaborate star forts, behind the way that they're laid out. And it doesn't seem to conform to what we would think of as the traditional element of achieving enfilading fire, such as with the large point on this particular structure. Now, for frequent viewers of the channel, you know that we've looked at star forts before, and we've posited many different theories. That the reality is these are simply foundation structures, or that these are constructions from an earlier civilization potentially, something that even preceded the Fourth Era, or the era that we call the Tartarian civilization, and that what we're looking at are the remnants of the main constructions of the Third Era, and that's a possibility we're going to explore. When you look closer, though, you can see that there are some fine details that do go far beyond the explanation of simple bastion forts. Now, there are examples of these bastion forts being successful in a military confrontation, such as the siege of Malta by the Ottoman Empire, and we're informed that the Knights of St. John were able to resist this attack. Of course, the star forts still look relatively pristine on Malta to this day, and we explored them in the Malta exploration. Perhaps they repaired them, or perhaps the siege didn't exactly conclude in the manner that we're told. Who's to say for sure, but there are too many remnants of these star forts, these geometrically precise foundation structures, scattered across the land to ignore. And as we've said, they vary immensely in size and design, and yet at the same time they do contain a design element that seems to be similar. This drawing here from allegedly the medieval times gives us the impression that star forts were part of the natural castle fortifications. And you have to imagine what kind of effort went into constructing these. Regardless of logistical limitations, we're always informed that in Europe they had the wonderful resource of time. They had hundreds of years to construct these bastion forts. All the effort and all the materials and all the qualified engineers who just seem to be running all over the place. Now, once again, the mainstream will explain this as being another one of these revolutions brought about by one of the great R words. Whether it was an industrial revolution, a renaissance, a rebirth, or a renewal, somehow, some way, they managed to adapt to the advent of cannons and gunpowder. And so they constructed many different variations of these bastion forts. They managed to prepare their defenses, they managed to build entire cities on top of them, and this is one of the greatest achievements of the Renaissance. But let's step back and consider, what if this is not exactly what we're told that it is? What if there's a more complicated dimension behind the application and use of some of these structures? And really, that's probably the most effective term that we can call them, because they are always structures and they do have a lot of geometric precision to them. Why exactly do you need total geometric precision in order to emplace your cannons or to achieve enfilading fire? You really don't need that. You just simply need to turn the direction of your cannons, at least if they operate in the manner that we were informed that they operated in. But in some of the smaller star forts, or structures, we have the theory that perhaps they served as some sort of function for a larger apparatus, or they're the bare bones remnants of a previous technology that we don't fully understand. Perhaps it was some sort of technology that was designed to integrate within the land to control the motion of the very water itself, whether it was a canal, a creek, or even a river, with a compilation of these structures operating in concert to achieve such a control. And we can see that subsequent civilizations, most likely the Fourth Era civilization, built on top of the remnants of these structures, because apparently they stood up very well. And whether you accept the mainstream explanation, an alternative explanation, or come up with your own theory, you can't deny the fact that many of these wondrous foundation structures do have many structures, ranging from what we think of as forts to entire cities that are constructed on top of them. Now, obviously, if we go off in the mainstream explanation, they weren't designed for this purpose. Although others will claim that yes, they were designed for this purpose, and building entire cities on top of structures was not a challenge during the Middle Ages and the period that followed, because it was the Renaissance. And as we said before, whenever you have a revolution or a Renaissance, you can do anything. You don't need motorization, you don't need mechanization, you don't need trains. You can accomplish any logistical feat because you don't have safety standards. You have intelligent artisan and craftsmen all across the land. And you don't have the diversion of modern communications technology and social media, which oddly enough people turn to, but then they want to claim as a reason for why we can't achieve in the past what we did despite having modern technology. Some of these fortifications, though, have a more defined function to them, and it seems as though you can go along with the understanding of what the additional function may have been. Indeed, if these are the remnants of the appearance of certain elements of technology, structures that were part of a larger apparatus that operated within the very land itself. The other element of star forts that we can't ignore is the fact that they are perfectly integrated with the natural terrain. Indeed, you'll see grass and trees that grow on top of the foundation structures. And so this is where a lot of the evidence for the theory that we have that the previous civilizations managed to achieve a much better or effective balance with the natural world. Now, when you look at this, and you can see this wonderful integration of the artificial and the natural. And is the explanation supposed to be that this was simply for the purposes of defense? Also consider the modern example. We'll be informed that star forts or bastion forts are obsolete because of the advent of modern firearms technology, and for the great mobile land armies of the 1900s and the 2000s with the advent of the main battle tank. Yet, looking at some of the other star forts, and you have to ask, could a modern army or a modern nation construct anything like this? Could it construct one of the smaller star forts if it were so inclined? And could it do so in a reasonable amount of time? Now, of course, we're informed that in the Middle Ages or right after the Renaissance period, they spent decades constructing some of these star forts. They even built one in Japan right during the Meiji Restoration, because apparently everything European was cool to Japan at that time frame. A Japan which had been isolated for over 200 years, at least according to the mainstream account, and they needed to have their own particular bastion fort or star fort. You look at some of these, though, and you can't help but be impressed by the intense application of geometric precision. How could anyone simply accept the fact that something like this was done just for the purpose of defense? And while we do have a few examples within the historical account, if we can take it at face value, of star forts being effective as defensive fortifications, we have many other accounts in which they were completely and totally ineffective, such as many of the great battles of the United States Civil War. We even have the example in the Battle of Mobile Bay, where star forts were completely ineffective in resisting the attack of the Union Navy. And many of these star forts have other structures around them which have additional questions. And we think of some of the larger city star forts, or star cities. There's many different names you could call these, and I have to admit star forts or star cities or even geometrically precise foundation structures sounds a little bit more appealing than simply calling them polygon forts or polygon constructions. But I suppose that would be technically accurate. We look at the older renderings or drawings of what these alleged fortifications or cities looked like in their origin, and oftentimes we see a tower at the very middle. And the explanation for that will no doubt be because they were supposed to fall back through each successive ring of this very complex geometric structure and make their last stand at the tower. And yet when you look at the way that all of these star forts integrate within the terrain, you can see that there tends to be the construction that defies the explanation that they were solely for military means. And while we can certainly attribute the defensive purposes of some of these star forts, we tend to see more complex constructions, all of course which endure to this very day, which give the hint of a civilization that valued geometric precision, and above that, valued integrating the artificial and the natural within all their constructions, whether they were building cities or technology that had some other application. Indeed, you'll see many examples of the star fort pattern, or the geometric pattern around the cities themselves, and then you'll see the more defined fortification that is constructed in conjunction with it. So what exactly does this all allude to when you look at some of this? And you'll find these bastion forts or these star forts in the most remote places, of course, which we can just turn our heads down and accept the fact that they could achieve anything logistically in the distant past. Again, you didn't need motorization, you didn't need any sort of ability to move heavy materials because people worked. And as some will say, they just simply worked until they died and they didn't question anything. Well, perhaps that's the more believable account from the mainstream. But there's also the other consideration when we look that oftentimes there are these cities that are constructed on either side of a waterway. And oftentimes these geometrically precise foundation structures are found near some sort of body of water or some sort of river, creek, or canal. And they're oftentimes integrated with them. And that's where we derive the theory of the fact that these structures seem to have something to do with the water, and perhaps they alluded to the technology to control the water itself. And now let's look at the Star City foundations. For frequent viewers of the channel, we've looked at many different cities that have that baseline map that show that they were elaborate star cities, or whatever name you wish to refer to them as, the cities that had these elaborate fortifications constructed all the way around them. And whether we're looking at Berlin or Prague or the other great cities of Europe, and it's not just in Europe, you'll find it in North America, South America, and other locations where you have entire cities that had these star fort constructions around them. Now granted, we're just looking at the maps that show us the very origin of these cities, and yet we can see very complex arrangements of these structures around these cities. These cities appear to have been built on top of them, and yet at the same time, these great cities, we're also told, were founded prior to the advent of this technology of the bastion fort, such as Frankfurt. And yet you look at the early maps of Frankfurt, and the official explanation will be the city was small enough at that time that they could construct elaborate fortifications that were geometrically precise, because they needed to defend the city from a potential attack, whether it was from the Ottomans, the Mongols, or if they were competing with the other great powers in Germany for control of the waterways. Perhaps we can accept that explanation at face value. But where did they get the capability to do this? How is it that they had the knowledge of engineering to quickly pass across all the areas? We also look at the example of New Orleans, where we see another star city formation. And that's how the city started. Even to this day in New Orleans, you'll find the remnants, though, of a couple star forts, whether it's Fort Pike or Fort Macomb, and whether they've been closed for years, there seems to be a desire to keep people from looking closely at some of these structures. Of course, if you go to St. Augustine, Florida to this day, you can get closer to the remaining star fort, but we forget that the original maps display that there was actually a total foundation structure that went around the original settlement. At least that's what we'll be told when the Spanish were settling the area. And yet there's other examples of these star fortifications that surround even Moscow, because apparently the citadel of the Kremlin was not enough fortification. They needed to establish an entire star fort around it. And so when you look at these various maps and you see that the way that these cities were displayed or drawn at the time, it gives you the impression that a lot of this foundation was already there, and that the city was simply constructed on top of it. Now, again, these maps are simply that. They're just drawings. Anybody could have done drawings at any time. They could have been inspired, or they could have been told to draw something in a particular format. But let's look at an example of a star city in Fort Madison, Iowa. Now, a lot of people wouldn't think that Fort Madison, Iowa is actually a star city, because when you look at the old bird's eye view of Fort Madison, Iowa, you'll see that it doesn't have the traditional patterns. Fort Madison is very interesting, though, because this was the first recognized settlement. Fort Madison is off the Mississippi, and it's the oldest settlement within Iowa. Indeed, it was settled before the War of 1812 and was lost. And when we look at the bird's eye view, we notice this very large and impressive structure. We'll be told that the structure in front of this clear fortification is a hotel, but we can see there seems to be a lot more to it, especially with the smokestacks and the built-up towers. So is this some sort of fort or fortification? We'll look into the exact account of the structure in a moment, but we look and we see that it's simply designated as a hotel on this bird's eye map from 1889. Keep in mind that at this time, Fort Madison had been continuously settled for over 50 years. And it's very odd that such a wonderful structure would be completed. Well, what we're looking at is actually the Iowa State Penitentiary, which was constructed in 1839. Very, very shortly after Iowa had become a territory, and 7 years before Iowa would become a state. So the mainstream informs us that as they were settling the area, when the populations of St. Louis and Chicago were negligible, not exceeding 16,000 or 12,000 if you accept the numbers, in Iowa, in the middle of an unorganized territory, they decided to build a very elaborate and impressive prison in 1839. And indeed, when you look at descriptions of this particular prison, you'll find that they call it a fortification. Now, how does this tie back into our exploration of star forts? This gives the numerous indications, and you'll find these hints that Fort Madison, the settlement or the eventual city in Iowa, was originally a star city, and that this is the remnants of it. And when you look at some of the material that this impressive prison was constructed out of, and it should be noted that this is still standing to this day, you'll see those signs of very advanced construction that were achieved in 1839. That settlers who apparently had nothing but time on their hands, who were trying to tame an area and civilize it, decided to build this particular structure. Now, there's no account of this being used as some sort of elaborate fortification, and even though Fort Madison fell to the forces of the British and the Native Americans that were fighting against the United States quite easily, I might add, at least that's what the official account says, there's no account of this subsequent fortification being used as a fortification. We're informed that it was always used as a prison. And yet we might recall the other explorations that we did in Iowa where they informed us that they used this thing called Anamosa limestone. And yet some of these structures don't look anything like Anamosa limestone. Perhaps you could believe that some of this was constructed by hand at that time frame, or maybe there's another explanation that this structure is far older than we're led to believe, and that there's the sign of erosion due to the fact that it is far older than we could possibly imagine. Could it be possible that this structure, this area that we think of as a state penitentiary to this day, is potentially another sort of reset compound from the past? We look at the Anamosa prison, and this is in Anamosa, Iowa, where we have that Anamosa limestone. That's exactly what they call it. But it should be noted that Stone City, where Iowa quarried this very impressive limestone, was not even settled until 1850. And yet you can find similar examples of the stonework with the towers on the prison in Fort Madison, despite the fact that it was constructed 10 to 15 years before Stone City was even settled. So once again, conflicting accounts, or you can just accept the fact that they just brought in this stone and they decided to construct this structure because there was no real reason to do so. You need to have a prison as you're settling the land because that's the most important thing to have. And indeed, when you look at many of the photos of the Midwestern cities, the earliest photos, they always have a prison. Yet you can also still see the same signs of advanced construction within this penitentiary. And if you have the means, I recommend visiting to this day and assessing the construction material for yourself. You won't be disappointed. So, were these star forts remnants of the Third Era civilization? Most of our explorations center around exploring the Fourth Era because we have the most remaining evidence from it. And of course, we're operating in the Contemporary Era, the Fifth Era, and we don't exactly know for sure how long ago these structures were constructed. We go off of our mainstream timeline because that's all we have to go off of, and we look at the reset period. Were these star forts from the Third Era? Is this evidence of a civilization that preceded the Fourth Era civilization that we call Tartaria on this channel? Well, when you look at the various structures, and there is the theory that perhaps in the Fourth Era they did experiment with building the foundation structures. And I do admit it is possible that these wondrous star forts, these bastion forts, or even the remnants that we have in Fort Madison, Iowa, could be constructed during the Fourth Era. But I think we also have a lot of evidence because of the fact that many of the more elaborate constructions that we see that we know are from the Fourth Era are built on top of these bastion forts, these star forts. It gives us the impression that this entire technology, this geometric precision, is from the Third Era. Of course, we're assessing things here in the Fifth Era, the Contemporary Era, and all we can really do is try to hypothesize exactly what happened. Was this a more advanced construction that eroded over time? Or is this simply the efforts of someone who was simply trying to repair ruins that they found? Or, as I always believe, the mainstream account does have a chance of being correct. It just feels that with each exploration, it seems to become less and less likely. And I wouldn't say that this exploration is any exception to that trend. Let's look at one final aspect with star forts. Palma Nova is one of the most impressive star forts, and it's really what you'd call a star city in Italy. And you look at the geometric precision that goes all the way to the center of the city, which they very clearly built on top of the star fort. You'll indeed see that the very diameter of this city or town or municipality, whatever you want to call it, is over half a mile in diameter. You can also find signs, though, of advanced construction when you look at it from the ground. You'll see no shortage of obelisks and towers and impressive columns that we tend to see when we look at these various structures. Now, there's also some sort of apparatus that still exists on the inside, and perhaps this would reflect the mentality of this being some sort of defensive fortification. But once again, it begs the question, why do you need such elaborate constructions, and why do you need geometric precision, especially seen from the air, to build a structure like this? Certainly there's easier ways to establish fortifications, and you can find no shortage of examples looking at the World War I and World War II, how very impenetrable fortifications were constructed without requiring this geometric precision. Indeed, these wondrous structures have been diagrammed and analyzed by engineers, and there's even the numerous tunnels and the subterranean component to them. So there's so many different dimensions and there's so many different perspectives to look at with these impressive star forts and these amazing fortifications. And yet you can find examples that seem to go beyond the explanation of fortifications, especially with the way the natural environment integrates with these artificial constructions. And I strongly recommend, if you have the capability, to explore a star fort within your area, and I'll leave the link to the map. What was the very height, though, of these structures? What did they look like when these star cities were constructed? Could these have been very advanced with wondrous obelisks that had tremendous technological capability beyond our imagination, integrating the very land within the construction itself? I think we have a lot of signs that point to this being a distinct possibility. What limits, then, did such a civilization have in their construction? What could they really achieve? It seems to go beyond our wildest imagination. But what do you think? What's your explanation for these star forts? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
This isn't an ordinary fight. This is a fight between the powers of light and darkness.
Today on the Restituto Orbis channel, we examine the account of the Victorian workhouses, or as we posit they are, the reset labor camps. As we fly over the Thames in London, we see the wondrous Tower Bridge of London, oftentimes mistaken for London Bridge, although there's a vast visual difference. This is another great product of the 1800s. And indeed, we're going to be focused on yet another institution of the 1800s, the Victorian workhouses. We have to go back to the origin concerning famines and plague. We're informed that the origins of the workhouse started in 1388. The effects of the Black Death, which had occurred decades earlier, resulted in a labor shortage and a subsequent act for the relief of the poor. So it's one of these accounts where we have a policy that's in place for hundreds of years and yet still affects the population in the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, or England as it was known during those years. We begin by examining the series of famines that occurred in the 1300s. There was a great famine and there were numerous famines. This weakened the population, a population that was focused on agrarianism, or bringing the harvest in from the fields. In the feudal enterprises at the time, they required serfs to bring in the harvest. We also had a 100 Years' War going on between England and France, and the war was allegedly paused because of the effects of the bubonic plague. Due to the weakness of these famines, the population was susceptible to the bubonic plague brought in by the fleas that rode on the rats. At least that's what history tells us, and many people were dying. People were dying in horrifying ways. The population of France decreased by 50%. The population of England at the time decreased by 20 to 30%. So you can see there was a disparity in how they were hit. This had grand social effects, and yet at the same time we're told that while it had great social effects, it wasn't until 1388 that they prevented laborers from moving around in England because there was a labor shortage. And they got right back to going with the war because, you need to get back to a war. And a plague and famine isn't going to stop a war. You also have the Poor Relief Act of 1601, and this is where we're told the first workhouses were established. We had the Great London Fire in 1666, and then after that, that brought us to the very questionable time of the 1800s. We started with the Industrial Revolution, which supposedly changed the nature of jobs, providing different jobs in different areas and bringing people off the farms. We had the Napoleonic conflicts that started the 1800s, or the Napoleonic Wars, and we've looked at these in detail before. And once these ended with the Industrial Revolution, we had many people wondering about the land, and now we look at the workhouses. And so here was the issue. You had labor laws that prevented people from moving from one county or one shire or one parish to another, and you had more people than you had work. So there were a lot of poor people. It should be noted, though, that the workhouses were for everybody. Orphans, the elderly, and even prime working age people seemed to end up there. What we're informed is that the workhouses were established so the state did not have to provide dispensation for these people. And there was supposedly a distinction made between able-bodied people who could work and idlers, or people who were able-bodied who opted not to work. The workhouses, we're told, were the Victorian era's answer for this. And so what they did was they had a design for these, although when you actually look at many of these workhouses that remain to this day, you'll notice that they are varied old world buildings, which seem to be many different designs. There's also the disturbing element that these workhouses seem to function as a place to incarcerate people. Indeed, many of the accounts at the time, such as from Charles Dickens' novel Oliver Twist, told us about how the workhouses function. The people who were there were fed and worked in very poor and harsh conditions, and they were kept away from the rest of society. They were given special uniforms to wear, so they couldn't really leave the workhouses. And if you look at how the workhouses were actually facilitated or run, they were operated much like prisons. Now, this is the mainstream account saying this. This is not some alternative history account. It is well known and well documented that these places were quite terrible. They were horrible. You will see those adjectives used frequently. The fact that forced child labor was a fact of life within the workhouses, or the elderly being forced to work, beyond just simply being a greeter at your favorite retail store. And while it may seem like it's a bit of a comical element, we have to consider that there were many unfortunate children that were taken away from their families. Children separated from their families, spouses separated from one another, the same practices that we saw when it came to the asylums. And there were also asylums operating at this time. So many different institutions, and yet it conflicts with what we're told about the fact that the great nations of Great Britain, England, the United Kingdom as it evolved, and then of course the colonies in the United States, that they cared about people, and yet they didn't have funding to provide these many institutions, yet somehow they were able to do it. The official story tells us that in Great Britain, that they delegated the care for the poor down to the parish level, and yet all these parishes constructed these workhouses. We're told that there was a template or a design for the workhouses, much as we're told there was a design for, say, the Kirkbride asylums, which, while it emanated in the United States, somehow it spread across the land. So, very, very odd series of conflicting accounts, and consider many of the horrors that occurred in the workhouses. You had long working hours, you had total control, people weren't allowed to drink, people weren't allowed to celebrate Christmas, at least until the later years of the workhouses, and there's conflicting accounts about that. During the many famines, which also afflicted areas around the Great British Empire during the 1800s, and we're not exactly sure how that happened, you had many people that sought emergency relief at the workhouses. In Ireland and Scotland, they called these places the poorhouses. And here you can see an example of one of the alleged designs of these residences, or residences for the poor, as they euphemistically called them at the time. And again, you can see that there is a vast disparity in the buildings. This is Patrick Colquhoun. He was a Scottish merchant and statistician, and he was quite in favor of the workhouses. In fact, he said that poverty is necessary and it's indispensable, lest someone like him actually have to work. There were contemporaries, though, that said that his remedies caused more evils than problems they solved, so perhaps Patrick Colquhoun would make a very effective modern politician. No wonder Scotland was all about signing those treaties of union, because then they could have their own people put in poorhouses, which is what they called workhouses in Scotland and Ireland, interestingly enough. So they still had this same model of these very well-constructed and well-built poorhouses, workhouses, or all the other names that we have for these places that somehow just seem to end up having people incarcerated at them. And the reason for this being was that they needed to give them jobs. They needed to provide them a means of existence. That's what the official story says. And you can also find other accounts of very cramped conditions, and these seem to vary. Although some people might argue that this doesn't look any more cramped than any military bay or barracks. You can find an example, though, of the rules and the orders, which do seem to have a bit of a military nature to them. Everyone will do as the master or mistress of the house tells them to do, that they have to be in bed by a certain amount of time and be up by a certain amount of time. Everybody has to work. Anyone found guilty of really anything will be punished by the utmost severity of the law, and that always seems to be the way things are. We do have subsequent accounts that they tended to loosen up the nature of these places once the works of Charles Dickens and other contemporaries made it aware to the population of how much people were suffering in these workhouses. There's also a conflicting account of how many people in the United Kingdom today actually have genetic connections with people who went through the workhouses. We're informed currently by the mainstream that about 10% of the population in the United Kingdom has a genetic connection to the people that went through these workhouses. It's difficult to say, though, the exact numbers of the population. I always found it fascinating that we knew the exact numbers for life expectancy even during the bubonic plague. We're informed that prior to the bubonic plague, when it hit England in the 1300s, the life expectancy was 29.2 years. And then after the bubonic plague hit, it was lowered to 17.4 years. Very precise numbers. Who exactly was keeping track of these numbers, especially during a time when we're told that they had to rely on census data from when the Normans conquered England? You'll find many images of these workhouses where you see numerous individuals. We have many pictures of the elderly. We have many pictures of children who are all eating as though they're in some sort of military organization in a giant bay. We also have many different diagrams and supposed designs for these workhouses, although one would expect they would be standardized. Of course, that's easy to explain through the mainstream, because we can simply state that because the running and the construction of these workhouses were delegated down to the parish level, it really depended on if there were local benefactors who would build them, so I suppose it makes sense. Yet every single time, and the fact that many of these workhouses survive to this day, we can conclude that they were very well constructed with the finest means available at the time. Here you'll see what was supposed to be one of the design templates for the workhouses, more of the Y-shaped pattern or separate yards. Now, I'm not going to say that this looks like a prison, it just happens to resemble the layout of a prison. I'm sure it's a coincidence. But of course, none of the workhouses seem to share many features that you would expect in something that was designed and built by a contractor. And so we have a similar account to the Kirkbride asylums, although it's safe to say that there's a lot more consistency observed in the Kirkbride asylums. So again, that points to the fact that the workhouses definitely seem to be something that was operated more at the local level, and yet they still seem to have some sort of national government guidance behind them. There's the unfortunate account of what was happening in Ireland with the Great Potato Famine that occurred during the middle of the Victorian era. And for those not familiar, the Victorian era was considered during the reign of Queen Victoria. And while it does not include all of the 1800s, it includes most of the 1800s. And it certainly includes the high tide, if you will, of the Great British Empire. Of course, one thing that doesn't tend to be mentioned with the Great British Empire were all the famines that occurred in India and the potato famine in Ireland. But that's not any sort of concerted effort by the government to cause these famines. It was just due to a lack of action or perhaps poor decisions that caused the deaths of many a people. We know that it's not going to be called genocide, and we're assured by many historians it was not a deliberate genocide. It was just some unfortunate decisions that led to the death of millions, sort of like the Napoleonic Wars. Looking closer, though, at the workhouses, we start to realize that they did seem to have a very different function. And despite the fact that people were aware of how terrible and horrible these places were and all the deprivations that those that were forced to reside in the workhouses endured for decades or their entire lives, were informed that the children that went through these workhouses did not receive proper educations, and therefore they were unable to ever escape this cycle that they were stuck in of poverty. Now, this is what the official mainstream account tells us, that these workhouses were established because somebody had to care for the impoverished, and yet there was a concern from the state that people such as you're seeing in this image were idlers, that they were able-bodied but they simply were too lazy to work. And as our good friend from Scotland said earlier, he needs people to work so he can have an easier life. Again, I'm just reflecting the mainstream account. I'm not making any judgments. But you can see how cramped quarters were in these workhouses, and this certainly looks a lot more cramped than you'll see even any military bay appearing. So it's hard to say exactly what was happening. But what can we conclude that these workhouses really represented? If these were contemporaneous with the asylums as we're told that they were, and we consider an alternative perspective of what was really going on, if you have a series of conflicts that are going on across the entire land, or dare I say a worldwide conflict, in which you're destroying the enclaves of a previous civilization, you have many survivors. You have many people that are taken prisoner. Entire groups of people, whole populations that were told in the 1800s were relocated. And where were they relocated to? There's a very interesting special relationship that the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and the United States have always had, even though in the very incipients of the United States we're told that it was a revolution to break free from the influence of the British monarchy. And yet then this special relationship was established. And so if all of these people were being brought from across the British Empire and across the nascent American colonies at that time to certain reception points, large ports of call, then perhaps they were bringing all these people in to be reprocessed in this new civilization. Or maybe it was just the fact that there were still many people from this previous civilization that were still across the land. In the United States, they called them Native Americans, and in the United Kingdom, Great Britain, England, they simply called them the poor. Because really, if you have no way to document or verify anything, you can pretty much say whatever you want. Now, granted, that's a rather extreme assertion and a rather extreme hypothesis, especially if you're a fan of the mainstream account. You certainly can't disprove it, although you can't really prove anything because, unfortunately, there are no first-hand sources left who can tell us exactly what happened in the 1800s. Indeed, there is nobody alive now who can tell us what happened in 1899 even. Whatever truly happened, though, this left a psychological scar on many people. There are people to this day that you can talk to who have experiences of the workhouses, or at least a collective memory of it, passed down by their family. And they talked about what a horrifying experience it was, such as this example of a prison ship, the hulk of a slope that was originally in the Royal Navy that was converted to be a prison ship. Imagine being forced to endure these cramped conditions and live in decaying wood during that time. And then you have the images and pay attention to what you see in the expression of the faces of these people. We know what these images are from, and we know what we call these places today, where people wear uniforms and they are processed and they are forced to do labor. We have many different names for it. Yet, looking at what remains of the workhouses, we do see a very elaborate architecture. And there's also the fact that many of them are still standing in perfect condition to this day. Now, when the United Kingdom finally went away from the workhouses in the 1920s, 1930s after reform was finally established and we're told that care for the poor went back officially to the government, then many of these facilities were, much like the asylums, converted into hospitals and other institutions and dividing up care for the poor. Indeed, we can see some of these accounts at the time from the 1800s that showed how the poor did not even have enough to eat, at least the people that they referred to as the poor, or perhaps labeled as the poor, picking the bones to live. There's also the type of work that they were doing. It seems to be very monotonous work. We're informed that they crushed the bones of animals to create fertilizer, and later accounts even state that they were crushing the bones of animals to create roads. Very interesting accounts. And the United States had its own workhouses as well. Yes, the land of opportunity, the land of so many millionaires, as some people have told me in comments on other videos, that there were just millionaires everywhere in the United States, St. Louis, Kansas City. But they had workhouses, or poor farms, or poorhouses as they called them in the United States. Indeed, here in Iowa, they had a poor farm. Why or how would you need a poor farm in the 1800s in Iowa when you're literally giving land away? Or you have 10% of the population that needed to go fight a civil war? And after that, you still had the Native American conflicts to engage in. But these poor houses or these poor farms did really exist in Iowa. They are very well documented. So again, this is another element of this relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States which exists to this day. Who knows, perhaps there's a little bit more to the Atlantic Charter than we realize. Perhaps it was in existence far longer than we know of. And again, you can find the same mix of old world buildings with these poor houses, these poor farms in the United States. Some impressive architecture. And every single state, much as they document their mental asylums in the United States, also documents the attempt to deal with poverty. And so it seems to be yet another layer, another institution that's designed to incarcerate people. Because that's really how these places functioned. Now, of course, officially you would understand that once you manage to achieve work on your own, or you were able to get a job, perhaps you could escape the cycle of being, how shall we say, a guest of these places. And here in Kansas City, they didn't have a workhouse, they actually had a work castle that was constructed in the later portion of the 1800s. Yes, a work castle. It makes total sense, doesn't it? This structure is still standing to this day, although it seems to have become a canvas for the Bob Ross version of graffiti. It's still rather intriguing that they decided to build a castle in Kansas City for the workhouse, or the work castle, because I guess you need the finest structure so you can house the people that are going to be working, who are poor. It only makes perfect sense, doesn't it? And naturally they have these postcards that show how wondrous the structure is. And it still stands to this day in Kansas City. A castle that was constructed for the poor, so they could work there. I suppose that makes a lot of sense, especially when you have millionaires all over the place. So, prison for paupers, that seems to be what the workhouses were for. But what was their true purpose? What was really going on at this time frame? We have to look at the grander scale of events, and we consider the Reset War that was occurring in the 1800s. After the reset from the 4th to the 5th era, we have numerous peoples who were across the land. Officially, the Circassians were an ethnic group from the Northwest Caucasus, an area that seems to come up in our explorations a lot, especially with Alexander the Great. These people were, unfortunately, in the way of Russian expansion, at least that's what official history tells us. And they had a very honorable military tradition and some rather unique styles of dress and clothing that were allegedly adopted by Russian military units after this conflict. In the 1860s, after decades of conflict, there was a forced relocation of these Circassians out of the Northwest Caucasus areas, and you can see that many of their styles of dress are quite intriguing and almost seem to be something from a fantasy land in many different ways, and yet we're told that these were just a group of people that were in the mountains and were simply, unfortunately, in the way of Russian expansion or settling of the Caucasus or the east side of the Black Sea. Very odd series of accounts, and yet we notice that this relocation of people matches another account that was going on in the United States at the same time. And we can see that there were numerous commanders in the Russian army who were told employed policies of total destruction. And oddly enough, it matched many of the policies of destruction that we saw going on at the exact same time in the United States when it came to how they were dealing with the Native Americans that were also, unfortunately, in the way of expansion. Again, this is according to the mainstream account. But could there have been a much more deeper story behind this, such as Tsar Alexander II, a contemporary of Abraham Lincoln, who even sent warships to help the Union during the United States Civil War? Oddly enough, Sochi, where that strange 2014 Olympics opening ceremony occurred, was in the land that was inhabited by the Circassian people. So many strange accounts and strange coincidences. But it's one of those accounts from the 1800s of the forced relocation. It's considered debatable what the true aim of these actions were. Some people call it genocide, some simply call it government policy to ensure that a government achieved its end. Which is when we consider the account of the Native Americans, the Trail of Tears, the forced removal of the Cherokee from Georgia, Alabama, the Seminoles from Florida, and numerous conflicts. We're told that this was a very terrifying event and that in many ways it was a great crime perpetuated by the United States against these Native peoples, and that's what the mainstream account says. But is that just to simply conceal the fact that there was a lot more going on? There was also the Great Sioux War that happened after the United States Civil War. The United States showed how morally correct it was by ending slavery, and then followed that up by continuing their expansion against the Sioux. And we have George Armstrong Custer, a famous military officer, who bears more than a striking resemblance in his younger days to actor Sean Penn, I'm not sure why. And yet we have similar looking images of officers just relaxing or luxuriating wherever they are, and are they really in a conflict, or are they just having a good time? Of course, we can justify that by saying the photographers only took pictures when they were relaxing. And of course, we have the very elaborate facial hair, whether it was Custer or General Crook, and their campaigns that were directed by Ulysses S. Grant, President of the United States, the Great Sioux War. We even have pictures of some of the Lakota leaders, Sitting Bull and Red Cloud. Red Cloud even met with Ulysses S. Grant, and they talked about the division of land. Nelson A. Miles, a U.S. Army officer who led the Great Victory. Most of the battles that the U.S. Army had with Native Americans ended in terrifying defeat for the United States Army. Great tactical defeats. Indeed, the entire regular United States Army was destroyed in the Northwest Indian War after the Revolutionary War. We even have accounts of an entire genocide going on in California, and we can look at the Native American population in California, how it went from 300,000 to under 25,000 by 1910. And that gives us the impression that there was unfortunately a death of many Native Americans that were occurring, but we'll be assured and reassured by modern authorities and historians that this was not an intentional genocide. Let's look at these conflicts, the Napoleonic conflict, the Circassian conflict, and the Native American conflicts. And we see that in the Napoleon Wars, 6 million people died. In the Native American conflicts that lasted for 100 years, supposedly, 4.7 million Native Americans died. It was probably many more, but that's a decrease of the population. And then on the high side of the Circassian relocation from the Caucasus to what's now Turkey, 2 million people died. Well, guess which one of these they actually call a genocide? I suppose the Napoleonic Wars, you can say that 6 million people died in the conduct of war, and they were incidental death. It was not an intentional attempt to destroy a nation or an ethnic group. It just happened to have the most number of people that died. As for the Native American wars that occurred in the United States at the time, we don't really know what the original Native American population was. We're told it goes anywhere from 1 to 10 million. That's quite a variance. Back to what we were talking about with workhouses. If you had all these conflicts that were going on across the land in the 1800s, whether it was the Mexican War, which oddly enough the United States Army suddenly expanded to a size of 100,000 when it had never been large before, and then that was quickly exceeded by the Civil War where they had armies that were larger than that. You have the Meiji Restoration in Japan, which supposedly brought the emperor back. You also had the Great Potato Famine occurring in Ireland. All these events occurring at the same time in the 1800s. And then strange international expeditions that were sent to China, where you supposedly had 8 nations operating together to put down the Boxer Rebellion. And oddly enough, when you look at certain images, their uniforms do seem to look rather alike. But perhaps that's just all a great coincidence. What was really going on with all these conflicts? It seems to me that this was an effort to destroy the enclaves or the survivors of any people that would not go along with the new order that existed after the reset. And what it all comes down to in summary is that both the asylums and the workhouses and the large factories were all established as relocation centers, places to send these people who would not reintegrate into the new society, what had come after the reset. And therefore you could keep these people at the workhouses, you could keep them at the asylums, and keep them out of the way of the new population. And you can see that with child labor and many of these other terrors that they do acknowledge now, that their purposes and their intentions were indeed achieved. We have many images that show us that slums did exist in these areas at this time, and yet these slums always seem to be centered around old world buildings. So we have the concept of prison for paupers, the workhouses in the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and the United States, contemporaneous at the same time. And we know that children, orphans were separated from their parents, families were separated, people of all ages were sent to the workhouses. They were separated, they were forced to work, and for the most part they were imprisoned there for the rest of their lives. Indeed, that's what the mainstream tells us. We also have the mental asylums all across the land, where people were sent to who didn't really seem to integrate with society, or were not fitting in with the new Fifth Era civilization. So it seemed you had two choices. You either faced indoctrination or incarceration. You either went along with where things were going, or you were incarcerated. And it seems as though that was an incarceration sentence that would last for the rest of your life. So you could start off as a baby, and then spend the rest of your life in one of these workhouses, if you're lucky. It seems as though the asylums were actually a level below the workhouses, for the people who were actively trying to prevent what was happening with the forces of the reset. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Now once more I must ride with my knights to defend what was and the dream of what could be.
Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we're going to be exploring the Forbidden Land, the North Polar region. And you might be asking, well, of course it's a forbidden land, because we're told by scientists and people who've actually been there, along with this very convincing aerial footage, that there is no land at where the North Pole lies, or at least where it used to lay, because there's debate about where the actual magnetic North Pole is. But we see that there are wonderful sweeping vistas and panoramas that show us how incredibly beautiful this land is. And yet at the same time we see that this is a tundra, or really the very arid counterpart to a desert in a cold region. An area that has no life of any sort, nothing grows there because there is no land to support it. This is exactly what we're told is at the North Pole, and in this forbidden polar region. If you're going to reach it, you have to travel by ship, preferably an icebreaker, because you have to travel through a lot of ice if you're actually going to reach the North Pole. And we have many well-documented examples of polar explorers trying to reach the Arctic. We also have an inordinate amount of attention that's focused on the Antarctica, especially because of the treaty. But in this exploration, we're going to examine the nature of the Arctic. We're also going to look at the previous maps, which seem to depict land at the Arctic, and try to posit some theories for why this was depicted in previous maps. What exactly is going on up there? What's the reality? Of course, we're well assured by the mainstream, and they've given us very convincing footage that there's no mountain there at the center of the North Pole. But what's the truth behind it? What do we really see when we try to explore it? Well, let's start with a Google map, because that's what all of us have access to, and any one of us can take a look at a Google map. And what does it really depict being up there at the North Pole? Well, we'll see that there's no actual land masses up there, so that seems to conform with exactly what we're told. Yet there seems to be some puzzling anomalies. For example, during the Cold War, we're told that the Arctic, or the North Pole, was feared as an avenue of attack. Isn't this interesting? And we have this unique little line here that's always appeared in the Google Maps, and there's been a number of theories for what's actually being depicted, but perhaps it's just merely an amalgamation of Google images trying to show us what's exactly going on up there. Yet no land masses, and we can see that it's in an isolated portion of our so-called globe. At least, again, that's what's depicted on Google. We also have accounts of a continent there called Arctica, but this was well over 2.5 billion years ago. That's a long time. I'm always amazed that scientists are able to use their ingenious techniques and methods to tell us exactly what this land looked like a billion years ago. I'm amazed that they can do it even 10,000 years ago. But these aren't things that we should be questioning. Now let's take a look at what previous depictions of the Arctic were in the past. And in this little document here, we see many depictions on how they illustrated the land in the past. And here we even have this odd diagram from Alexander's time, which looks very geometrically precise. We also have depictions from Greece, which, oddly enough, show what appears to be a circle or a disc. although we're also told that the Greeks knew that we were on a globe. So I'm not sure. And again, we're not debating what the actual shape of the land is in this exploration. We're merely looking at how it was depicted over the years. What exactly do we have that's displayed and shown? And here we have this globe here that shows that there was a pin in the top of it. We've always had land, though, that's been shown, interestingly enough. And we'll be told that the cartographers at the time didn't exactly know what they were doing, or they didn't have the real scientifically confirmed observations and data. And here we have Mercator's famous map, which does show land masses around the North Pole and even a magnetic rock or mountain, along with other continents that we may or may not recognize. And here is that magnetic rock or mountain. So it seems to show a conflicting account of what's depicted and what's really present at the North Pole. Why exactly would the cartographers, and there's many different examples and many cartographers, depict land at the North Pole if there was no land there? If it's just ice and the only thing you're really going to find is any sort of pressure hills that are created by the ice, there's no actual land there. Did the cartographers not know what they were doing, or did they decide to take a risk and a chance and get themselves in a lot of trouble of what could potentially be an executable offense because they depicted maps that were incorrect? Indeed, we have numerous accounts of legendary lands that are up at the North Pole. Lands that we are told and assured do not exist and are simply in the imaginations or misinformed impressions of the cartographers. And that's exactly what we'll be told. Yet when you look at this document, and when you look at many other documents and books from the time, you'll find that the vast majority of the depictions of the North Pole showed there being land there. So what exactly was going on with that? Conversely, though, according to mainstream accounts, these cartographers who were so misinformed and didn't exactly know what they were doing were still able to compose maps that explorers during this time frame, the 14th through the 16th century, were able to use to effectively navigate lands. So, again, it portrays a conflicted and contradicting picture of the exploration alone of the North Pole. And as we look in more recent times, because would you be surprised to know that the North Pole was not actually reached by human beings until the 1920s, and even those accounts of exploration and individuals actually reaching the North Pole are conflicted. And I've always found this area to be very intriguing, and the other thing is the fact that we only have the North Pole being famous in more recent times in popular culture because of Santa Claus. Yes, that's how a lot of people know about the North Pole, especially in the United States, where I grew up, is the account of Santa Claus. Now, granted, the effect and celebration of Christmas has changed in the United States over years, and it seems to go longer and be much more commercial. When we look at satellite images of the North Pole, because I was trying to get a better look at it, we have our typical, very unique images that don't really answer any questions. They do reinforce the notion, though, that it is nothing but a pack of ice up there and there's no real land, although how exactly can you tell? And this official image from NOAA has many issues in and of itself. And then, of course, we have these strange weather images that always convey the impression that there's a strange circular presence at the North Pole. Well, perhaps that's just the layout of the land, and that's merely the weather patterns that were going on at the time. Look, this is from NOAA and it's from the government. We know that we can rely on it completely, because they would never make misrepresentations towards us. Although, I do have to consider the representations. There are many different issues that show that the land seems to be questionable up there. The weather patterns are very questionable, and even though it's just ice, one of my significant questions with the North Pole is, why did we always have such a fixation on it? What was always so important about exploring it if there's really nothing up there but ice? And once again, we have in these other interesting images from satellite, there always seems to be some sort of strange circular pattern up there, a very precise circle at that. And we'll be told that it's because of some limitation in the equipment or some other sort of anomaly, and that when they transpose the interpretations of the data and the telemetry, this is the result that we have. So don't ask any more questions and just accept what we're given. Indeed, we have many other satellite images that give you the impression that what we're told about the North Pole is questionable. Now, we could always say that there's a reason for this. This is just simply to keep us pondering and speculating on it, and merely to devote our time in trying to figure out exactly what's going on up there. Although what I found interesting in more recent years is how there seems to be less and less attention directed towards this area. And yet many of the supposed satellite images create more questions than answers. And isn't it interesting how when you look at Google Map, you just don't have a very simple overall image of the North Pole or the polar region? It's forbidden land, because there is no land up there. but people just want to explore it and go there. But remember, there's no land up there. There is also a conspiracy theory saying that there's a hole up there that allows you access to the inner earth, and we're merely sharing all the things that have come across popular culture. We're not embracing any particular theory during this exploration. We're just looking at all the different perceptions that we have of the North Pole or the Arctic. Santa Claus is up there. There's a hole to the earth. Well, would you be surprised to know that the very first explorer who officially and well documented reached the North Pole, Roald Amundsen, used an airship to do so. And in fact, they're even talking about using airships to reach the North Pole now. Oh, and I will comment that Roald Amundsen was Norwegian, because it's a matter of Norwegian national pride that they were the first ones to reach the North Pole. Now just imagine this, jumping on an airship to be able to reach the North Pole. Now, granted, they say they used the airship to help them reach it, and then it was a land expedition. Although there's a number of difficulties with a land expedition when you're going across frozen ice, because there's really nothing to sustain yourself on frozen ice with ice packs, and that's all you have for hundreds of miles. There's also the problematic interpretation as to the North Magnetic Pole, the geographic North Pole, and the geomagnetic pole. Seems to be a lot of conflicting data. I mean, exactly how am I supposed to use my magnetic compass if I'm going to conduct successful land navigation to reach the North Magnetic Pole? Or is it the geographic North Pole? Or is it the geomagnetic pole? Which one am I going to? I don't even know. Consider the recent show from the 20-teens called The Terror, which is a well-documented... It's a documented expedition to reach what was called the Northwest Passage, led by a British explorer named Franklin. And there were 2 ships that were involved, and the show documents all the difficulties that they had. Now, granted, it's a bit of a fictional account of true life events, or so we're told. The Franklin expedition was stuck in pack ice north of what is now Canada, and they were close to the Polar Circle, or the Arctic Circle. Although, conflicting accounts, you're not really sure if they're actually in the Arctic Circle or not. And they had all sorts of issues with their compass, and the show does a wonderful job of conveying all the dread. I mean, just think about it. If these 2 guys can't effectively lead you out of a difficult situation, then nobody can. And that's really what the show questions, is leadership and the difficulties faced, and some individuals understanding that they're in a land that's very hostile and is working to kill them. And the show very effectively depicts that. It also depicts the deteriorating aspects of society and a military chain of command in very difficult conditions, because the commander, Franklin, simply wants to reach the Northwest Passage at all costs. But he does have more experienced subordinates who have been involved in other Arctic expeditions, and they understand that the land there is trying to kill them. And again, it begs the question, if everyone was aware of this and if they knew this in the 19th century, as these well-documented expeditions occurred within, then why did they continue about with them? Why were they so obsessed with trying to find a Northwest Passage? Well, there's numerous different explanations given. It's for the fame and the glory of reaching a passage in very difficult to explore and traverse lands, or there's economic reasons, or what have you. And yet, in this particular show, The Terror, you get to see all the difficulties that the crew faced from these 2 ships as they were stuck in pack ice. The ships were unable to sail, and they had to come up with other means first to sustain themselves, and then to walk across hundreds of miles of this Arctic land, although we're told they weren't really in the Arctic Circle, but they were close to it. And again, it depends. The show also even goes to a little bit of a mythical account of a beast called Tumbuk, or Tumbuk, who hunts the crew. They encounter an Inuit shaman and his daughter, and because of a misunderstanding, end up unleashing this beast, which also begins to attack and kill the crew, including the commander Franklin. The rest of the TV series, or at least the first season of it, revolves around the crew's attempts to survive. They're being hunted by this supernatural entity, and they're also facing the difficult environmental conditions that they face in this extreme location that they're in. I think what this really conveys, though, is that along with the depreciation of a society and a military chain of command when faced with extreme conditions of survival, we also continue to ask the question, why was exploring the North Pole so important? Why was everyone so fixated on this effort if, as you see in the background of these 2 characters, there's really nothing there? There's nothing that anybody would want. There's nothing that anybody would need. There's nothing that anybody in any sort of minded society that's based on materialism, as we're reassured by virtually every institution that we have in our society that we're all about materialism. Why would people want to go to a place where there's absolutely no materials? There's nothing of value up there. That's what we're told. And yet the difficulties and the travesties faced by this expedition shows us that people were willing to put in this kind of effort and this sort of will to reach this location. Now keep in mind the Franklin expedition wasn't even focused on reaching the North Pole. It was just trying to find the Northwest Passage, the waterway through the pack ice that's a shortcut to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and vice versa. And there's all kinds of accounts of other ships facing difficulties, being stuck in the pack ice. There's even one extreme account of an entire crew being frozen on the ship and dying. Well, in the TV series The Terror, the crew finds out that there's no way they're going to get their ships out of the pack ice. They're being hunted by this supernatural entity, and they have to escape. And their only way to escape is to actually prepare an overland expedition to walk to a nearby base in what is now Canada that's 800 miles away. By the way, did you know that our well and famous Admiral Richard E. Byrd was one of the first ones to fly over the North Pole? And this was supposedly well documented in the 1920s, and this was a well-funded expedition. Although more recent questions from other explorers, to include the Norwegian explorer, question Byrd's sextant data and say that he didn't actually reach the North Pole. He merely got close. And that seems to be the recurring theme with a lot of the other expeditions when it came to reaching the North Pole from the late 19th all the way to the early 20th century, is that they didn't actually reach it. And there was all this scrutiny of all the data and the distances traversed. And there were numerous explorers who claimed to have reached it, but then they were questioned on it. So why is it we show this level of scrutiny with reaching this particular area? We have this obsession with reaching this particular area. And then we devote all these resources, all this time, and most importantly, all these lives. Now, granted, the lives lost in exploring the North Pole certainly pales in comparison to all the conflicts that we have across the land. But we always go back to all these conflicting accounts because we're told that the survivors of the Franklin expedition simply wandered around in this tundra environment for some as long as years before they all eventually perished. And from the official account, they just disappeared. And historians will tell us that there were other accounts with it. Although, if everybody died and there was nobody survived to relay an account, how can you know exactly what was going on? You have some very dramatic images, though, of the North Pole, which give us a conflicting account again with what we're told is up there. Now, we'll simply be told, well, this image isn't exactly from the North Pole, it's from nearby lands, and it's not the frozen ice that we have. Although, oftentimes we're given the impression that there's a different account with it. Again, going back to the old Mercator map, which shows the presence of a magnetic rock at the very center. And we know, or we're told, remember, the difference between what we know and what we're told, is that there is a north magnetic pole up there. Now, do the compasses work on that? Is the pole drifting because of a factor of change, or even just a change in the timeline? We're not really sure. We also have strange photos of these explorers who claim to have reached it, and yet somehow they seem to have brought rock with them that they could build up this little monument to put a flag in. And of course, this will be told to us that no, they didn't actually reach the North Pole, they weren't anywhere close to it, and they just wanted to claim that they were, for the fame and fortune that came along with it. There's also other depictions, though, that give you the impression that there's much more going on in these isolated lands than first meets the eye. Now, when you compare and contrast everything that we're told, so let's recount so far. We have Google images that show us that there's nothing there. There is no land. We have older maps that shows us that there is indeed land, that there are even accounts of other individuals and species of people. We even have the ongoing myth of Santa Claus, and of course we're going to explore the myth of the origins of Santa Claus, and no, it's not the happy story that we like to believe. This is the book, The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus, written by L. Frank Baum, who was also the author of The Wizard of Oz. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. This was recently adapted into a Rankin and Bass special in the 1980s that I remember watching, and it was very well done, and it featured the voice actors from the TV show The Thundercats at the time. And it was quite an interesting story because it seemed to have a bit more of an old world feel to it when it talked about the actual origin of Santa Claus. Indeed, in the story, there's even an account of giants from Tartary that serve an evil force. Now, granted, this is Tartary, not Tartaria, but the similarity in wording is quite interesting. And also the sort of omnipresent myth that you have that's conveyed in this world. So if you have the means to watch this special, and of course I'm talking about the 1980s special, I would suggest looking at it and get an idea of what it depicts. Now back to the North Pole, you're almost kind of surprised that they don't actually have an image like this and just say, yeah, there's actually a pole at the North Pole. Now of course that's merely a concept of comedy, and we'll be expected to believe that, but yet that's what's put in popular perceptions. That's what's put in our minds. So why exactly does that image persist? Because is it important or isn't it? Is there land up there, or if it's just ice sheets, then why in the heck did everybody care about getting there? So we could say we went to the North Pole, of course. We were looking for fame and fortune, and famous families like the Rockefellers were willing to fund us. Yes, of course, it's always that explanation, isn't it? You'd want to go to a very terrifying place where you've got decades or over hundreds of years of explorers dying there, but we're going to be the ones to do it. We also have the change that we're always told about the actual amount of ice up there and the amount of pack ice, and we're told that changing conditions in our environment are causing this pack ice to either recede or change in its nature, and that's also having an effect of what's going on up there. And you can find no shortage of well-documented and scientifically researched articles that'll tell us all this. Although, again, it just becomes hard to actually see for yourself if you're just any random individual who's trying to research the North Pole what exactly is going on up there. You have a lot of accounts, and you have different scientists saying different things. You have different political entities saying different things, and it's either used as something to motivate the great exploration in the hearts of people or to convey the concept of concern and fear. Now, I can't imagine why anybody would want to be conveying concern and fear when it comes to this area. There's even other myths that seem to accompany the North Pole. And what I find interesting when we were looking at that map earlier of all the different depictions of what it looked like over the years is that you go all the way back to the time of Alexander the Great, supposedly, and they were visualizing what the North Pole looked like. And again, this is what we'll be told. It's just pack ice. That ships have to be specially equipped, and they have to have icebreakers if they're actually going to get through this pack ice and use the proverbial/actual Northwest Passage. And it doesn't matter how many issues or challenges that these explorers faced over the years, and to this day, we're told that this was a very strategic area. And in fact, during the Cold War, there was a concern by both sides, the Soviet Union and the United States, that the other side would use it as a primary axis of advance for land forces. Yes, that was actually a concern. Or much more likely a ballistic missile attack, because a trajectory of a missile being fired over the so-called top of the Earth would be the most expeditious way to lob your ballistic missiles at each other. And so therefore, there was a great effort, at least on the United States side, and I'm sure there was a similar effort on the Soviet Union side, to build early warning bases, ballistic missile early warning bases. And we'll be exploring this effort because it's quite intriguing the amount of resources that both nations devoted towards securing this area. And indeed, Admiral Richard E. Byrd's explorations of both the Arctic and then subsequent Antarctica revolved around concerns about attacks supposedly from these areas. Although we quickly got a treaty in 1960 in the Antarctica, even though we're told that the Cold War was at its most difficult period because of recent events with Francis Gary Powers and the U-2 being shot down. Now, back to the North Pole. You have other maps, and the National Geographic Society has always been very well affiliated with its explorations and scientific publications concerning the North Pole. Indeed, they were the ones who documented Admiral Byrd's little flight up there, and then subsequently questioned that they didn't verify his data in the 1990s. What exactly does it really look like up there, though? If we simply accept these images, then that's fine, then there's nothing up there. It's merely pack ice, and why is everyone so concerned with pack ice? Or better question, why was everyone so concerned in the past with exploring simple pack ice? Why was it such a big deal to go up here to this pole that's really just a pin in a map in pack ice? Just to say that you were at the top of the world, the top of the globe, or the top of whatever the realm is really shaped like? See, that's always the thing. It generates more questions than answers, because if it's a globe, and if there's nothing more up there than pack ice, then why should anybody care? Yes, of course, you can just say Santa Claus is up there, and he's working in his shop with his elves, and everyone's going to get their gifts on time. And don't forget that we're going to keep celebrating Christmas earlier every single year. Or, I'm sorry, the holidays. Let me make sure I use the proper term now in the United States, if you know what I mean. But it really doesn't matter, because it all comes down to what are the perceptions to the North Pole, what do we really see when we go up there, and what are we actually trying to explore? And here is the most compelling evidence. It goes back to the Mercator map. There were too many maps and there were too many illusions that tell us that there was land up there to be ignored. Now, could there be some other explanation for why these map makers depicted land up there? And it's very true that if these map makers made mistakes and other explorers came back and said, hey, look, there's no land up there, what do you think would have happened to these map makers? They probably would have faced death or much worse, at least if we're to believe the social mores at the time in Europe. And granted, this was during the Renaissance, although one thing that was not challenged during the Renaissance was the absolute authority of monarchs. And do you think a monarch would allow themselves to be made a fool by some cartographer that made a mistake? No, absolutely not. We go back to the depiction of Mount Meru, or the central mountain of the world, or the cosmos, depending on your vision or view of it. Or is it really just some sort of central terrain feature in the land? That seems to be a theory for what's being depicted, especially in the Mercator map of the North Pole. Now, of course, again, this will be dismissed, and we'll be told by our official scientific figures of authority that there's nothing up there. They assure us that it's just ice, and that may well be. But there's too many conflicting accounts to simply ignore this. And we've explored the whole concept of Mount Meru as the center of cosmology when we looked at the beautiful architecture in Southeast Asia, including the Temple of Wat Arun, which in and of itself, the central praying is supposed to be a depiction of this incredible mountain. This incredible mountain which is at the center of all things. Is it just simply a mountain, or is it a nexus point of some sort? Is the real nature of the land really so based upon the shape of it, or the actual existence and nature of it? Oftentimes it seems as though many forces want to compel us to simply embrace a belief, and simply hold on to that belief, no matter what sort of countering evidence that we see. How do you know exactly what's a fact and what's merely suggested as a fact? Is there a difference? Are there any true facts? A lot of people have a great deal of difficulty existing in a state of ambiguity. And yet at the same time, the depictions of this incredible mountain at the very center of all things, the center of the land. Is there really a center of the land? Whether it's shaped like a ball, a flat plane, or something even else, being curved in ways that we don't understand or ways that we can't perceive. Or is it all just talk? Maybe it is exactly as we see it. We just don't know, and I certainly invite you to share in the comments what you think the shape of the land is, or what the nature of the land is, because it's a lot more than just considering the shape. When we consider the ways that the cosmological example of Mount Meru show us that there is an actual center point of all things. Is there really a center? Is there a nexus? Is this a location where many different realms of existence are actually possible? Or is it simply, as we're told, it's simply a pack of ice that really doesn't have any importance to it? Well, if it is, it certainly does not reflect well on all the effort and all the expeditions that were launched to actually reach and find the North Pole, not to mention all the great difficulty that explorers encountered. But really what this revolves is thinking outside of the categorized thinking patterns that we often encounter each day. You're looking at things with a very different perspective. You're starting to open up your mind to different possibilities. Now, a lot of people do not want to do this. A lot of people will do anything and everything to resist even trying to consider other possibilities, because that's what we're supposed to do. It should also be noted that there are many appearances of the name Mount Meru and many different associations with it across the land. So it's so important because it represents the center of all things. Is the cosmological interpretation at the heart of Buddhism correct? I don't know. I really don't know. But I think it's something important to consider, because if there is a center point or nexus in the land, perhaps there's some sort of knowledge that we can glean that can help us in our understanding of our present situation. There's a lot of conflicting theories that this may really be going off into left field, and perhaps you may see this exploration as being out there. And that's okay, because sometimes you really have to go out there to ponder the possibilities, and if you're not willing to do it, then you're limiting yourself. And if you decide to limit yourself, well, then that's completely your choice. As I've always said, I'm not here to tell people what to think. I'm just here to present alternate forms of perception. And this is one of the most radical alternate forms of perception, and yet in some strange way, shape, or form, it seems to answer all the conflicting accounts and questions that we have. Now, it could merely be a coincidence, but once again, that's a lot of coincidence. I leave it to you. What do you think? What's really going on up there? What's the real nature of it? Is it just pack ice, or is it something more? Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.